for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his beautiful, beautiful speech. I just want to start out again today by sending my sincere solidarity to all the survivors and families and communities that were shaken once again, particularly the nation, to Kamloops, to Sequepim about the Kamloops Residential School. I lift you up today and every day. The TRC reported that at least 40 to 60% of all children who attended the schools died, and sometimes, as I indicated yesterday by Mary Ellen Clown, as a result of purposefully exposing children to infections such as TB, spreading the disease throughout the school population. And Murray Sinclair who chaired the TRC, has indicated that he believes that the death count could be much higher due to the school's poor burial records, as many as 25,000. Burial grounds that we have known about, Madam Speaker, but this government failed to act to bring our loved ones home. Calls to action, 71 to 76 of the TRC report, where former lead commissioner Murray Sinclair has indicated there has been no action. Once again, left up to Indigenous peoples to find our own loved ones. Findings that have left shockwaves throughout Indigenous nations throughout the country. Trauma, grief, hurt, betrayal as a result of the violent genocide that was perpetrated on Indigenous children and families simply for being who they were, for no other reason than to advance the government's economic agenda, behaviors that continue on today. Violent acts rooted in the violent dispossession of lands by eradicating our cultures and leaving us sometimes sheltered on our very own lands. This included attempting to assimilate our children, to get us out of the way. And as we are finding out, resulting in the deaths of thousands of children, genocide. And here we are today again, fighting to get immediate resources and support from the government to at the very least, provide families with closure as a result of their genocide, fighting with the federal government to stop fighting First Nations kids in court, fighting with the federal government to stop fighting St. Anne's Residential School survivors, a government who won't even acknowledge that what they committed and continue to commit against Indigenous peoples in Canada is genocide, where hopes of achieving some sort of justice and some sort of closure is waning. As shared by former Commissioner Murray Sinclair, who stated in quotes, "I can hear not only the pain and anguish, but also the anger that no one believed the stories they had told. I can also hear their sense that they have lost some hope that maybe those children that hadn't returned might still be found. They know that may not happen. Sacred lives, children exposed to acts of genocide who never returned home, a violent violation of human rights. And let's not forget parents. As I have spoken about before in this House, countless stories from parents. Heartache each September when our children were robbed once again and taken away to residential schools. There was no more laughter, play, joy. And can you imagine how the heartache grew when their children never returned home? Never returning home. Never to hear echoes of laughter and play. Never to have closure, wondering where their babies were. Cruel. Violent acts of genocide. Something that this government refuses to acknowledge continuing to leave whether Indigenous peoples experience genocide or not in residential schools up for debate. In fact, there's a class action lawsuit involving 101 First Nations seeking reparations from the federal government for the impact of residential schools, and the federal government continues to deny any legal responsibility. In court filings, the government admits the schools were meant to, in quotes, assimilate Indigenous people, but denies the federal governments of that era, in quotes, sought to destroy the ability to speak their Indigenous language or lose their customs or tradition of their culture. A government that has made genocide denial a norm. The truth needs to be honored. The experience of parents needs to be honored and lifted up. I wish to honor all parents and families today who lost loved ones as a result of genocide. We will fight to bring your children home, your siblings, your cousins, your aunties, your uncles, your sisters, your brothers. And the number of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirits reported as a genocide in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. Genocide continues with no action from the federal government, and an announcement today of releasing an action plan, but that in quotes implementation plan is still to come with no release date in sight. Something that Chief Judy Wilson, Secretary Treasurer of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, has called, in quotes, another delay a tactic, and also delaying the funding resources that families of survivors need now. We have people today going missing and murdered. Things have got to change now. She went on to state that, in quotes, Canada's genocidal legacy is going to continue because there is no change, real leadership, and real commitment. We just get these flowery reconciliation speeches that fall short in action. Or what Pam Palmatter, professor from Ryerson University, stated, in quotes, a code for we didn't come up with a plan. Further noting that a plan that doesn't have concrete actions, clear timelines, and measurable outcomes is not acceptable, she said. And a growing distrust from Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit across this country, including NWAC, who has lost their faith in the federal government, and it's done with its, in quotes, toxic, dysfunctional process. Instead, NWAC is planning to release its own national action plan, with President Lorraine Whittam said, one that puts, in quotes, families, not politics first. And let's not forget the Millennium Scoop and the fact that this government continues to break the law, failing to uphold the Human Rights Tribunal ruling to immediately stop racially discriminating against First Nations children on reserve, where Canadian hero Cindy Blackstock has affirmed in the Tyee that the federal government, in quotes, has repeatedly failed to adequately compensate 165,000 First Nations children and families whose childhoods and lives were stolen through government neglect, she says, adding that, in quotes, what we know from the tribunal's uncontested legal finding is that Canada's non-compliance has been linked to the deaths of some children, harms to other children, and unnecessary family separations of thousands of others. So it is not unlike the types of things that children in residential schools faced. Canada is continuing that behavior. She went on to further note that, in quotes, it reinforces the responsibility that I and everyone else have to make sure that the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action are actually implemented, and that the federal government stops fighting against equity of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children today, and stops fighting residential survivors in courts. Residential schools, 60 Scoop, the Millennial Scoop, MMIWG, ongoing genocide, a continuation, as Murray Sinclair stated in the Globe and Mail in 2008. We would have apprehended, in quotes, by the child welfare system if it hadn't been organized today. So I'm asking all members of the House to support this motion, to listen to calls coming from Indigenous peoples across this country and act now. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.